warning to our viewers, this documentary contains true events involving the deaths of children. Some viewers may find the content disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. October 25, 1994. 9:07 p.m. A metallic red Mazda Protege rolls down the boat ramp and breaks the dark surface of John D. Long Lake, South Carolina. Inside, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander remain strapped in their car seats, crying out for their mother in the darkness. The same mother who just moments ago stood at the boat ramp, released the parking brake, and watched as the water slowly consumed her children. For the next 9 days, she would look America in the eye and tell a story of a violent carjacking that never happened. But the truth at the bottom of that lake would shatter a nation's trust and reveal a betrayal beyond imagination. Welcome to the Shadow Files crime series. Tonight's case will shake you to your core. Take a moment to hit subscribe, drop a like, and please let us know where you're watching from. And now, we begin. 1994, a year when America was changing. The internet was in its infancy. 24-hour news channels were becoming a fixture in American homes, and a nation was learning to process tragedy in real time through the unblinking eye of constant media coverage. In Union, South Carolina, life moved at a different pace. A small textile town of just over 10,000 souls, where the rhythms of life still followed the shift changes at the mill, where families had worked the same jobs for generations, where the American dream seemed simpler, more attainable. But the America of Norman Rockwell was fading. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing. Young families struggled to keep up with a changing economy. And in Union, like everywhere else, the facade of small-town perfection was beginning to crack. It was against this backdrop that a 23-year-old mother would commit an act so unthinkable it would force America to confront its deepest fears about family, trust, and the darkness that can lurk behind the most innocent faces. The early 1990s had seen a wave of high-profile cases involving parents who killed their children. The nation was becoming increasingly anxious about the safety of its youngest citizens. But what was about to unfold in Union would shake America's confidence in ways no one could have predicted. On October 25, 1994, as the autumn chill settled over South Carolina, a young mother would set in motion a chain of events that would expose not just her own deadly deception, but the fault lines running through the heart of American society itself. Michael Daniel Smith was 3 years old. His brother Alexander Tyler just 14 months. 2 little boys who would never get the chance to grow up. Michael was the kind of child who filled rooms with laughter. At 3, he was already developing his own distinct personality. He loved toy trucks, would spend hours pushing them through makeshift roads in the backyard dirt. His father David remembers how Michael would wake up early each morning, eager to play outside, his small hands already gripping his favorite red fire engine. Alexander was just beginning to toddle around on uncertain legs, following his big brother everywhere. Their shared bedroom was a treasure trove of childhood innocence. Stuffed animals carefully arranged on tiny beds, picture books stacked in corners, and walls decorated with family photos and colorful alphabet charts. Every Sunday, the boys visited their grandmother's house. She kept a special drawer in her kitchen, filled with cookies and small toys just for them. Michael would always share his treats with his baby brother, a gesture of love that made their grandmother's heart swell with pride. Their last Christmas together, captured in photographs that would later haunt their father, showed Michael helping Alexander unwrap presents. The boys wore matching pajamas, their faces bright with joy. No one could have known it would be their only Christmas together. In their final family photos, taken just weeks before that October night, Michael stands protective over his baby brother. Alexander reaches up to touch Michael's face, a moment of innocent affection frozen in time. These images would soon be plastered across national news, transforming from cherished family memories into evidence of lives cut tragically short. These were real children, not just names in a headline or faces on a missing persons poster. They were brothers who shared a bedroom, who had favorite toys and morning routines, who had a father who loved them deeply, who had their whole lives ahead of them. until one autumn night when a decision was made that would turn their shared bedroom into a shrine of memory. Behind every unthinkable act lies a history, not an excuse, but a dark path that leads to an even darker destination. Susan Vaughn's childhood ended at age 6 when her father died by his own hand. The trauma of that loss would echo through decades, shaping a pattern of depression that would follow her into adulthood. When her mother remarried, it should have been a fresh start. Instead, it marked the beginning of another nightmare. Her stepfather, Beverly Russell Jr., a prominent local businessman and rising star in South Carolina's Republican Party, harbored dark secrets behind his respectable facade. He would later admit to molesting Susan during her teenage years, a pattern of abuse that wouldn't end even after she became an adult. On the surface, Susan seemed to defy her traumatic childhood. She excelled academically, maintaining a bright smile that masked deeper troubles. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, she was drowning. At 13, she made her first attempt to take her own life. By high school, the pattern was set. Academic achievement mingled with emotional turmoil. A second suicide attempt followed a failed relationship with a married man. Each success in public life seemed matched by private despair. In 1991, Susan married David Smith. To outsiders, it appeared she had finally found stability. Within 3 years, she would give birth to Michael and Alexander. The young family's photos showed smiling faces, hitting all the markers of small-town success. But the shadows of her past refused to fade. The sexual relationship with her stepfather continued in secret, ending only 6 months before that fateful October night. Her marriage to David began to crack, and a new relationship with a wealthy local man seemed to offer an escape from her troubled life, an escape that would come at an unimaginable price. In that last family portrait, Susan Smith holds her sons close, smiling at the camera. But behind her eyes, a decision was forming. A decision that would transform this troubled young mother into something far more sinister. A woman capable of the unthinkable. As we go into the most chilling details of this documentary, take a brief moment to like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, for more in-depth investigations and analysis of significant cases like this. October 25, 1994. Began like any other Tuesday in Union, South Carolina. Susan Smith arrived at work for her morning team meeting at the local textile mill. Her colleagues would later remember nothing unusual about her demeanor. At lunch, she sat with a coworker discussing an upcoming presentation. Normal conversation, normal plans. But in her purse lay a letter that would change everything. A rejection from Tom Findley, the wealthy son of her employer. His words were clear. He didn't want a relationship with a woman who had children. 4:30 p.m. A call to her mother about Christmas plans. Their last normal conversation. 4:37 p.m. A text message. I'll be home in 20 minutes. A promise she never intended to keep. As she left work carrying her presentation materials, Susan Smith had already made her decision. But her colleagues watched her walk away, noticing nothing amiss. No one saw that behind her calm exterior, she was methodically executing a plan. The drive to John D. Long Lake wasn't part of her usual route home. In her car, Michael and Alexander sat in their car seats, likely growing restless as the familiar path to their house became unfamiliar. In the trunk, her wedding dress and family photo album, symbols of a life she was about to destroy. What happened next would be revealed in her confession 9 days later. 3 times she let the car roll toward the water. 3 times she pulled the parking brake, a final moment of hesitation before the unthinkable. Then, in the growing darkness, she made her final choice. She stepped out of the car, reached back in one last time, not to save her children, but to release the brake. As she ran to the nearest house, her story was already taking shape. A tale of a black carjacker at a red light, a desperate mother's plea for her missing children, a performance that would captivate and deceive an entire nation. The facade was perfectly constructed, every detail carefully planned. But like the car slowly sinking into the dark water of John D. Long Lake, the truth would eventually surface. And when it did, it would reveal something far more horrifying than any fictional carjacker. For 9 days in the fall of 1994, Susan Smith looked America in the eye and lied. Each tearful plea, each desperate appeal was part of an elaborate performance that would shake a nation's trust to its core. Her story seemed straightforward enough. A red light at an intersection, a black man with a gun, a mother forced from her car while her children were taken into the night. The details were specific, calculated to play on the worst fears of a small southern town. Within hours, her story went national. Television cameras captured her grief in intimate detail. A mother's anguish laid bare for millions of viewers. America watched as she clutched her estranged husband David's hand, their shared pain seemingly bridging their separation. Union mobilized. Hundreds of volunteers combed the countryside. Flyers with Michael and Alexander's faces appeared on every storefront. Church groups organized prayer vigils, a community united in desperate hope. But behind the scenes, investigators were already seeing cracks in her story. The traffic light she claimed had turned red would only change if another car triggered it. There was no other traffic that night, no witnesses, no traces of a phantom carjacker. FBI agents noted something else, something that made their skin crawl. While the cameras rolled, Smith would make sobbing sounds, but their trained eyes noticed there were never any tears. She spoke more about her appearance on camera than about finding her children. Day after day, her performances grew more elaborate. On November 2, 9 days into the search, she sat for 3 morning show interviews. She looked directly into the cameras and declared, "I did not have anything to do with the abduction of my children." Sheriff Howard Wells watched these appearances with growing certainty. He later revealed, "We knew by the second day. We knew she knew where those boys were. We just prayed they were still alive." As suspicions mounted, Union held its breath. Some defended her passionately, unable or unwilling to believe a mother capable of such deception. Others whispered their doubts, haunted by something in her eyes that didn't match her words. 9 days of lies were about to end, but the truth that would emerge would be far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. While Susan Smith played the role of grieving mother for the cameras, investigators were piecing together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Each new detail pushed them further from her story of a carjacking and closer to an unthinkable truth. The first crack appeared at the Monarch Mills intersection. The traffic light that Smith claimed had stopped her car that night held a crucial secret. It would only turn red if another vehicle triggered the sensor on the crossing road. But Smith had been adamant. There were no other cars around. It was a small detail that opened a flood of doubts. FBI agent David Espy, tasked with administering Smith's polygraph tests, noticed something disturbing. She would make sobbing noises, he would later testify, but when I looked at her eyes, there was no water. There were no tears. Behind closed doors, she spoke more about escaping to the beach to avoid media attention than about finding her sons. The timeline was full of holes. Witnesses couldn't corroborate her movements. Her stories about where she was headed that night kept changing. Agent Pete Logan, who spent 24 hours interrogating Smith, began to see a pattern of deception emerging through her carefully crafted responses. At John D. Long Lake, divers made a critical error in their initial search. They had assumed anyone trying to hide a car would drive it in at high speed. They never considered that someone might let it roll in slowly from the shore. The Mazda lay 122 feet from the shoreline, far beyond their initial search zone. Sheriff Howard Wells and his team employed a careful strategy. They played the role of sympathetic listeners, slowly building trust. But in the background, they were meticulously documenting every inconsistency, every changed detail, every behavioral red flag. A breakthrough came when Agent David Caldwell obtained a letter, a rejection from Tom Findley, ending their relationship. The letter revealed a possible motive, but more importantly, it showed investigators a side of Susan Smith they hadn't seen before, one capable of deep bitterness and calculated revenge. The investigation team knew they were racing against time. If there was any chance the children were alive, they had to break Smith's facade. But they also knew that rushing could cause her to shut down completely. Every interview was a delicate balance between pressure and patience. By November 3rd, Sheriff Wells had seen enough. He made a calculated decision. He would tell Smith something that wasn't true, that undercover officers had been working a drug investigation at the intersection on the night of the alleged carjacking. It was time to end the charade. The morning of November 3rd began with one final performance. On CBS this morning, Susan Smith sat on her living room sofa, clutching David's hand. When asked directly if she had any role in her children's disappearance, she looked straight into the camera. "I did not have anything to do with the abduction of my children. Whoever did this is a sick and emotionally unstable person." At 12:30 p.m., Smith told her mother she and David were running errands. Instead, she was led to a safe house for what would become the most crucial interrogation of the case. Sheriff Howard Wells had prepared carefully for this moment. He knew what he had to do. At 1:40 p.m., in a room at the First Baptist Church Family Center, he confronted Smith with the truth about the traffic light at Monarch Mills. Then, he played his final card, a lie that would expose the truth. "We had undercover officers working a drug investigation that night," Wells told her. "They never saw your carjacker." It wasn't true, but it was the push Smith needed. After 9 days of lies, the facade finally cracked. "Susan," Wells said quietly, "it is time." Her response came in a whisper. "I am so ashamed." What followed was a confession that would shake hardened investigators to their core. Smith described driving to John D. Long Lake, her initial plan to end her own life along with her children's. 3 times she let the car roll toward the water. 3 times she stopped it, until the final time when she stepped out and reached in only to release the brake. The dive team returned to the lake with new information. 6 minutes into their second search, they found what they had dreaded, the underside of an upside-down Mazda, nearly 18 feet beneath the surface. The visibility was only 12 inches, but what they saw would haunt them forever. "I saw a small hand pressed against the window glass," diver Steve Morrow would later testify, his voice breaking. The children were still strapped in their car seats, hanging upside down. As news of the confession spread through Union, the reaction was explosive. Outside the sheriff's office, crowds gathered, their shock turning to rage. Cries of "murderer" and "baby killer" filled the air as Smith was escorted to a waiting car. For the law enforcement team, the toll was devastating. Hardened officers broke down in tears as the car was pulled from the lake. The betrayal was worse than if there had been a real carjacker. They had been forced to watch, helpless, as a mother lied about her children's fate while knowing the terrible truth all along. That evening, Sheriff Wells faced the cameras one final time. The strain of 9 days showed on his face as he announced what many had begun to suspect. There had never been a carjacker. The killer had been the one person those children should have been able to trust above all others: their mother. As Susan Smith's trial began in the summer of 1995, Union, South Carolina had become a town transformed. News vans clogged the streets. Satellite trucks crowded the courthouse square. A community that once prided itself on privacy now found itself under the unblinking eye of international media. Her defense team, led by David Bruck and Judith Clark, made a calculated decision. They wouldn't deny her guilt. Instead, they would try to save her life by painting a portrait of a deeply troubled woman who had snapped. "This is not a case about evil," Clark would tell the jury. "This is a case about despair and sadness." The prosecution, led by Tommy Pope, had a different story to tell. They described those 6 minutes at the lake in excruciating detail. They were in that car, screaming, crying, calling for their father, while the woman who placed them in that car was running up the hill with her hands covering her ears. But beyond the courtroom walls, Union was grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Smith's false accusation of a black carjacker had exposed deep racial wounds. Her brother, Scotty Vaughn, would later apologize to the black community. "We hope you won't believe any of the rumors that this was ever a racial issue." but the damage was done. From Maine to Washington state, newspapers condemned how quickly some had accepted Smith's story based solely on racial stereotype. "When you think of crime in America," one black leader noted, "we have to stop thinking about African Americans." After just 2.5 hours of deliberation, the verdict came: guilty on 2 counts of murder. But when it came to sentencing, the jury showed mercy that surprised many. Instead of the death penalty, they chose life imprisonment. Their reasoning, forcing Smith to live with what she had done, was a harsher punishment than death. 3 decades later, the scars remain. Union would never be the same. The lake where Michael and Alexander died became a painful reminder, drawing mourners and the morbidly curious in equal measure. But from this tragedy came change. Law enforcement agencies across the country revised their approach to missing children cases. Investigators learned to look closer to home first, to question even the most sympathetic witnesses, to follow evidence rather than emotion. For David Smith, the pain never ended. At Smith's 2024 parole hearing, his words still carried the weight of that October night. "What she did not only to Michael and Alex, she came pretty close to causing me to end my life because of the grief she brought upon me." Union, South Carolina still stands, a town forever marked by 9 days of lies and a truth too horrible to imagine. But perhaps its greatest legacy is a warning that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't strangers in the dark, but those closest to home. Some wounds never fully heal. Some questions never find complete answers. 30 years after that October night, the ripples of Susan Smith's actions continue to spread through time, touching lives far beyond the shores of John D. Long Lake. Michael Daniel Smith would be 33 today, his brother Alexander Tyler, 31. We can only imagine the men they might have become. Their shared bedroom, once filled with toys and laughter, became a shrine to innocence lost, 2 lives cut short by the one person meant to protect them above all others. Their father, David Smith, carries their memory like a weight he'll never put down. At Susan's 2024 parole hearing, his words cut through 3 decades of pain. "That's only 15 years per child, her own children. It's just not enough." The board agreed, unanimously denying her parole. But from this darkness came change. Law enforcement across America transformed how they handle missing children cases. The automatic trust once given to grieving parents gave way to a more thorough, evidence-based approach. Every false accusation is now examined not just for what it claims, but for what it might hide. Union, South Carolina learned its own hard lessons. About trust betrayed, about racial accusations carelessly made and their lasting impact on a community. About how a small town comes together to heal wounds that seem unhealable. The water of John D. Long Lake still holds its secrets. Beneath its surface lies not just the memory of that terrible night, but a warning to future generations. About the masks people wear. About the stories we too easily believe. About the darkness that can lurk behind the most trusted faces. Michael and Alexander rest together now, in a single white casket with gold trim behind the Bougainville United Methodist Church. Their grave has become a place of reflection, where people come to remember not just how they died, but that they lived. 2 bright spirits who loved trucks and games and each other. Their story has become more than a tragedy. It's become a lesson, written in grief and remembered in change, about the price of deception, about the cost of trust betrayed, about how the greatest dangers sometimes come not from strangers, but from those closest to us. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of Michael and Alexander Smith is the reminder they left us, that truth, no matter how painful, must be faced, that justice, no matter how delayed, must be served, and that innocence, once lost, must never be forgotten. For Michael and Alexander Smith, October 1994, forever in memory. If you enjoyed this content, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep creating content we're passionate about sharing with you.